Hey everybody, and welcome to the Bare Root Project. I'm your host Dave Kearns, owner of Kearnsy Consulting and Educational Services. Today we're talking about pruning. I'm pretty excited. In my experience, I've seen a lot of mistakes, but today I'm going to help you make sure that you don't make those mistakes. But before we get into that, watch my intro. Trees are important. I mean, yeah, like I'm beating you over the head with a stick about it. Like you're probably sitting in a building framed out of wood, you know. You cross a bridge, well, they used to be made out of wood. Even cars were made out of wood for a little while. So, we have at least that to thank them for. But then we have the fact that there's shade. You ever sat outside on a hot day? That's shade. It's what makes living where I do bearable. So, we got to think about how we're cutting that branch off and at least start with a little bit of respect for the tree. I talk to a lot of homeowners who are like, whatever, it's just a tree. I'll get my Sawzall out. It's like, whoa, pump the brakes. That branch is actually pretty important. Let me tell you why. The number of branches on a tree can tell you how much its capacity is for photosynthesizing. That's really important as well. So, the idea being that when we're trying to decide how much we're taking off a tree, we have to look at what its ability to handle that loss of resource is. I think of it like this. Imagine I walk into your kitchen, I take a third of your food across the board. It's like, I know I could probably handle a little bit of a diet. That's not necessarily going to impact my life all that much. That being said, if someone came in and took maybe 50%, then it's a little more touch or go. I have to decide what resources I'm spending and why. So if it's an especially hard year, maybe that impact is a little too much for me to handle. Now, we have seen shrubs and trees and things like that get shaved right down to the ground, or maybe even just pruning it back to leaving 1/3 of live growth left. We have to understand that this puts a lot of stress on plants. It's not necessarily that we can't do it, but it's like some trees and shrubs can handle it better than others. So we have to think about how much food resource we're taking away from this plant every time we prune. That means that the rule of thumb that we create as an industry is about 1/3. You're allowed to take 1/3 annually off any twig, branch, or tree. Within reason, We want to make sure that those wounds have a chance to heal over. But just think about how much food resource you're taking away from something in any given year. If we start going back at 50% and leaving even a third of its live growth, you know that water and fertilizer is going to be a major component of the life of that tree for that growing season. Branches fall off a tree, that's the tree's way of saying, hey, I don't need you anymore. However, it doesn't always get to make that decision. So when we ask ourselves, or more importantly an expensive arborist, why the heck am I paying to prune this, or why am I doing it, we look beyond that point of, well, the branch is in the way when I try to get out of the car. We want to make sure that we're benefiting the tree, we're benefiting us, and we're benefiting whoever the heck has to own that tree after we're done with it. Maybe you don't plan on owning it forever. So, let's make sure that we try to avoid some mistakes. Why do we prune? Well, we can break that into a couple quick, easy answers. We're looking for dead wood, we're looking for decayed wood, and we're looking for decaying wood. So we call those the 3Ds. See? 3Ds. Now, once we take out the dead, the diseased, and the decay, we don't have to worry as much about branches falling out of the tree because the tree was done with them. That means that we can start looking at the crossing and rubbing branches. Yeah, pretty cool. Crossing and rubbing. That's right. So, as branches cross and rub, they cause wounds. And in trees, just like us, hey, we don't want wounds. We want them to heal over quickly. So we got to make sure that if we're making wounds, we're making clean wounds. Tree biology is cool. I think it's cool. I think it's really cool. But without boring you and getting into a whole new topic, I want to tell you just enough that you're actually going to know why we're cutting branches off the way we do. Alright, I want you to think of trees like a bundle of straws. They've got layers. So, of course, bark has to protect everything. That's, what keeps it from getting like a sunburn and drying out. Now, the next layer inside of that, we're looking at like conductive tissue. That's moving nutrients up and down the tree. That's really important. We kind of need that. Now, everything on the interior of that, generally speaking, is there for structural support. We call this heartwood. And in most cases, not all cases, that's really just there as like, some extra support. Think, hey, it's harder to break 10 toothpicks than it is one. We got that idea from trees. Anyways, the reason this is important is because as the tree grows, there's this like little zone of differentiation. We call it the bark collar. That's really important. And when we're cutting a branch off, we have to decide where the tree can naturally heal over that wound. Without healing over that wound, we're going to get decay. And that decay is going to chase down that center column of straws, right? That's no good. That means our tree can fall over if it doesn't put more live growth on to outcompete that. So, we want to look at the branch bark collar. It's like the zone of differentiation between, hey, I want to be a stem and this is my little branch. So, when we're pruning a branch off, we want to see if we can find that. The idea being that we don't want to cut into that callus material, that kind of swelling around the branch. That's what's responsible for growing over the wound once we cut the branch off. You know that adorable little donut that you see growing over an old branch? That's the tree compartmentalizing over the wound. You gotta remember that, like, trees don't necessarily heal. They just compartmentalize and try to wall off decay. So, when we cut the branch off and we say leave like a flush cut, that means that we're cutting into that collar. And that means that we're cutting into the wood that's responsible for healing over the wound. Now that's no good. So, the idea being that sometimes we leave a bit of a stub. But what happens when we leave a little bit of a stub is that stub has to decay before it falls off and the tree can eventually heal over it. Think about the tree's putting on all these layers of straws. Eventually, it's going to grow over that wound, but how long does it take? That's what we're trying to minimize. So when we're cutting a branch, we want to make sure that we're cutting right on that zone of differentiation where it becomes a branch and it wasn't that collar. You can see in the picture here, I've given you a couple options of, this is where we want to make the cut and this is where the healing is going to actually develop. Here's the thing. Yes, most of the time when the branch is this small, you don't have to worry about tearing or anything like that while making the cut. But when the branches get a little bit bigger, the stem gets a little bit bigger, we want to make sure we reduce that tearing. So, what do? It's called a snap cut. Look, another picture for you. See? Aren't you happy I switched to video? Now, the idea being that we want to make a small cut on the bottom. This is in the compression wood, so make sure you don't go more than a third or your saw is going to get pinched. Now, the second cut's on the top. Now, when you make that cut, we know that that branch is going to fall. So watch your toes. Don't stand underneath it. Remember, I'm not telling you to go and cut a branch off. I'm telling you, don't hurt yourself. So, the idea being that once you cut that off, you're going to have a little bit of a stub. That means you can take your time to really line up your saw. Now, I'm going to tell you, the first maybe 15, 20 cuts, you're really going to take your time. It might take a couple minutes to make your very first cut, but I encourage you to take your time and do that because you will eventually become like Edward Scissorhands where you're just banging off branches. But we want to make sure that we're not causing unnecessary damage to the tree. Remember, that's why we're paying arborists so much. We're really good at it. We can make like hundreds of that cut over and over all day because we do it for a living. So take your time and learn how to do it if you're going to prune your own trees or shrubs. And always remember, wear PPE, That's another reason we get paid the way we do. We do everything you would do, but safely and with PPE. Now I'm going to let you guys in on a little secret. The way trees grows in forests, which is where they usually grow, versus the way that they grow on, say, someone's like front lawn, are completely different. Now you have to think about the amount of sunlight hitting that tree, and depending on what that tree appreciates as far as how much sunlight it gets, can dictate what its growing habits are like. So, think of it like this. You know that blue spruce or the white spruce on your neighbor's yard that just keeps getting wider and wider every year? And every year they cut that lowest rung of branches off. Well, what's happening is the tree is naturally trying to cover the base. The way that spruce can repopulate in nature is called layering, where a branch will swoop down from a tree, touch the soil, it can then, produce a root system and start off as a new tree. That's what gets you that big, silly kind of shaped tree in the woods. So, by limbing up that spruce tree, we're really not accomplishing anything. What we should be looking at is like a width reduction on the lower, maybe third of the tree. If we take up to 1/3 of live growth off each branch all the way around the tree, we can reduce the length of the lower branches, effectively reducing the width of the tree. Now we have to remember that we can't take more than a third off. Remember the whole food resource thing. Now, this is all really important because at the end of the day, those branches are going to want to touch the ground. But if you say cut 4 years worth of growth off, that weight reduction is going to come back down in 4 years around the same point. So at least now we can figure out like, hey, if I do this now, we're probably looking at pruning again in another few years. Oh man, like how often do we need to be doing this? Like, well, it depends, right? Are you paying someone else to do your pruning? I mean, you might decide, hey, I got to cut that branch off maybe once every couple of years, right? But if you're hiring someone, maybe you want to stick to hiring them every like 3 to 5 years. That's from my side of the industry where I find a lot of people sit into. They want to make sure that their trees are cared for well. They don't want to do all that work themselves, but they don't want to be paying someone to come in and do 1/3 reduction pruning every year. So, the idea being that we want to get into pruning cycles. Pruning cycles allow us to at least try to assume when the next time we're going to be spending that money on it. It's really important. So, depending on who you ask, you're going to get a different answer. I think 3 to 5 years is pretty fair for most trees in landscape situations. Now, when I first moved to Saskatoon, I always thought, hey, 3 to 5 years, that sounds great. It keeps you from getting too many problems kind of piling up on you. And then I noticed that, like, hey, most people actually prune it every 5 to 7 years. And that's because that's what the city pruning cycle is in this area. That's at least what I can tell. So, really, at the end of the day, we just have to decide how much deadwood and how much accumulation of debris and structural issues do we need to prune out before we wait, right? And so that's why we're going to stick most of the time to that 3 to 5 year window. That way you're erring on the side of caution. I don't know about you. I don't want to wait 7 years to trim a shrub. Sounds like a lot of jungle and dump runs. So, I'm going to give you a couple options here. Now, of course, this is up for debate. Everyone kind of sees this a little bit different, but this is how I've broken it down to my clients over the years. Option 1. I would like a magazine pristine shrub. Okay. That requires probably 2 trimmings. Now, in the spring, we're going to trim it the first time. That's really important. It's going to set the tone, the shape, right? Then after we get a bunch of heat and rain, it's going to grow again, which means we have to trim all that back down. We have to let it grow incrementally because we want some density, right? We don't want a hard shell outside and just a sticky mess inside. Option 2 is, kind of the same but less work. I don't want it to be a perfect magazine, and I'm willing to trim it once. Well, I'm going to suggest that you wait until the majority of the heat and the rain is done for the season, because that'll at least make the burn of looking out the window a few weeks later, realizing that it looks like you did nothing, hurt a little bit less. Trust me, I've been there. Now, if you're like me and you personally don't love trimming shrubs, maybe you do it for a living, I don't know why you'd be listening to me if you're doing it for a living. You probably already know what I'm about to say. I just don't trim my shrubs. Not for like a couple years. I like the natural shape. So what I'll do is maybe a 50% reduction on most of my shrubs if I have them. And I'll just water and fertilize the junk out of them the year that they do. I do that maybe once every like 3 years. That way I get a nice natural shrub and I don't have to worry about like my shed disappearing behind like a giant lilac or something. Alright, so there's the basics of pruning trees and shrubs. It's not rocket science. It's a little more involved than grab the old cutter and just whack the branch off, but I mean, hey, life is a learning opportunity. So I hope that you learned something. I hope that, next time you go to cut a branch off or you see someone cutting a branch off, you'll say something. Just imagine how many times I see people cutting branches off and just want to be like, oh my gosh, that's going to be a flush cut. See you in 10 years when that thing starts to rot. Thanks for joining me on the Bare Root Project. I'm your host, Dave Kearns, the owner of Kearnsy Consulting and Educational Services. Now, remember, if you hit the subscribe button, nobody's going to be like, ooh, you watch Kearnsy Consulting videos. You'll just know if I put new videos out. You want to hit the little bell there? No one will know except for my YouTube account, which will say, hey, Dave put out a new video. You should watch it.